Hello. Our last video covered a lot of terminology as it relates to sciences and into the place of biology in the sciences. We have had a look of the scientific method, reviewing it step by step. I hope you found this useful. And I realize that it may have been a little heavy when it comes to the theory aspect of the material, but I promise that this next video section is lighter again. So this time we will mention just a few words more about this science, while our main focus will be on reviewing the characteristics of life. Why don't we get started right away? You might remember from our earlier videos that we talked about the science and how scientific method works. But sometimes, and to be honest, quite often actually, things don't go the way we have planned. And as I have shared with you before, I spent some time into pharma and therefore can vouch for this. So what happens sometimes in pharmacology research, for example, is that drugs are developed for one use, but then we find out that it works better for another use. And I wanted to talk about one example of this with you, just quickly. So high blood pressure, known as hypertension, is a good example of that. This is something that affects many people. Nearly half of the adults in the US have hypertension as defined by the systolic or diastolic blood pressure or are taking medication for it. What's shocking about this is that out of these people with hypertension, only 1 in 4 have their hypertension successfully managed. And I think that I took this table from the materials by the American Heart Association. What you can see here is that many of us are living with pre-hypertension or high blood pressure. So clearly this is a problem that would be very attractive for the pharmaceutical companies to tackle. Because after all, what do we want? We want good long-term customers who will buy our drug for a long time, preferably for the rest of their lives. And hypertension medication sounds like that to me. We remember that the kidney plays a major role in filtering the blood and regulating, for example, the blood pressure. So a lot of pharmaceuticals have been developed to bring the blood pressure to the normal range. One thing that I have not discussed with you is that when we are developing a new drug, the process includes several stages. By the time we get to the human trials, we always start with males as the first test group. Can you think of why this could be the case? You might have seen a graph like this, as everyone seems to be talking now about the vaccine development for the COVID-19. So on a pharmacological trial, the early human trials contain only a small number of volunteers. But as I said, they are almost always men. And there is a very good reason for this. And if you have studied female menstrual cycle and hormone activity during that, we will notice that there are a lot of changes throughout this. And that's why it would be hard for us to know if the changes that we are seeing in these females are due to the drug or their normal hormonal changes. And if the hormonal changes throughout the month play a role, in which part of their cycle each of the women who volunteer are in. Whereas with males, the hormonal levels are fairly stable, so that's why. And in one of these trials, we saw that the drug that was being developed was successful in regulating the blood flow, bringing down the blood pressure, all those good things. After all, that's what we wanted to do. And as one does, we had our volunteers testing the drug. We saw that the results that we were wanting to see, their blood pressure was going down, and we asked patients to report also any side effects. This is a standard practice in pharma trials. And one side effect that men kept repeating was to do with, well, you know, having an erection taking place. And if we think about this particular drug, it makes sense. This drug controls blood flow locally. So someone realized at this stage that selling a drug for this purpose rather than for hypertension would be more profitable. And a drug that we now know as Viagra was born. The reason why I'm sharing this story with you is to show that a lot of the time in science, things do not go as planned. And if you think about it, that's good. If everything went as predicted, what would be the point of doing these scientific trials? Another definition that we run into in science at times is a definition to basic and applied sciences. Basic sciences are sometimes referred as pure sciences. They study facts about things. While applied sciences are all about practical, real-world uses. What I think about this division is that a noteworthy point is that you must first know the basics before you can start to apply this knowledge. An example of what I mean by this, one good example of field where these two go together is genetics. We first had to gain understanding of the basic structure of DNA and so on before we could then give it practical uses, for example, in predicting diseases, testing parenthood, finding evolutionary links, and so on. I already told you an example about Viagra. Another accidental finding was actually penicillin. And antibiotics have changed the world, saving so many lives. And I do want to mention here, though, the problem with overuse of antibiotics, which has resulted in the development of resistance in some bacteria. From this slide, I do want to mention a few words about the importance of sharing our findings. One of the common route for doing this is peer-reviewed journal articles. In a peer-review process, a group of experts in the field evaluate the work submitted and may require further additions or clarifications, for example, to be included in the paper if the paper is to be published. So there is quite a high quality control in place in this way. The other thing that is so great about scientific method and publishing our findings is that the paper that results should be so clear and detailed that anyone else can repeat this experiment and get the same results. So in the field of science, there is a lot of retesting, and one has to be open to have their findings and conclusions drawn from these challenged. And here is one of the papers that has gone through this process. It is mine published in the Journal of Magnetic Resonance Imaging. So let's jump back to this slide where we defined biology as the scientific study of life. And if you remember, we also expanded that to include interactions of different forms of life and with environment. Sometimes students wonder what I mean by this last point. Just as a reminder, we can work that out by asking, are rocks alive? And of course they are not. But that does not mean that we should not study them or know about them. But the biggest and most important point that I wanted to highlight here was that biology is all about life. And I think that the next thing we should do, we should define what is it for something to be alive. How do we define something as being alive? So here I have a list of 9 qualities that define life, and we will go through these, some with more detail and some more briefly. Well, the first thing that I am mentioning here is that life and living things have an order. Life is highly organized. You can think of this as everything in a living thing being at the right place where it should be. And when you think about it, when we look at the living things in a close detail on a cellular level, there is a lot to see. Yet despite all these differences between cells and tissues, they make an united whole. The next one that I wanted to highlight was that living things respond to the environment. For example, what we see here is one of my favorite plants. Mimosa is this sensitive plant that has these sensitive leaves that will instantly droop and fold when touched. And after a few minutes, the plant returns to normal. This is not just larger animals or plants. Even the simple bacteria are known to wiggle their way away from an environment that is negative for them. For example, from too high pH. And I think that many of us have seen examples of this even with our indoor plants. How plants start to lean towards the light source. Or how flowers of the plants open for the day and close for the night. These are all examples of these forms of life responding to their environment. The next one that I wanted to talk about with a few words is reproduction. I have a challenge for you. Can you show me something that is alive but is not a result of reproduction? Well, I cannot think of anything because as far as I know, all living things must have originated as a result of reproduction in the first place. Do remember though that sexual reproduction, where we have mother and father who both contribute to the genetic makeup of the offspring, which is the strategy that we use, it is not the only way to reproduce. For example, some plants rely on asexual reproduction, where one individual can be the source of an entire reproduction, like in plants that reproduce by budding. And I guess that this brings us to the question, which one came first, the chicken or egg? Adaptation is yet another characteristic of life. The example that I picked here is the difference between brown bears and polar bears. The differences that we see are a result of these adapting over a long period of time to the environment that they are in. One way to define adaptation could be that it is the process of changes accumulating over generations so that these changes make an individual a better fit to the environment that it is at. Let's look at the growth and development. All of us have started from a single cell, the mother's egg cell, that was fertilized by the father's sperm. Yet over time, we grow into this complex animal with bunch and bunch of cells that are different and serve different purposes, right? So we must grow and develop. As we mature, we gain new skills and abilities, knowledge, and so on. And this all is seen also in other forms of life. This is an interesting one, I think. Let's talk about regulation as a characteristic of life. We are constantly coordinating things both internally within our body, but also how we act in a larger scale. You can think of fields of psychology and sociology. These are processes where living things control and coordinate its various activities. For example, nervous and endocrine system are important for this in animals. The next one, homeostasis, is one of my favorite concepts in biology, and one that you will keep hearing me refer back to time and time again. So it is really worth of learning now, and there are many ways how you might have seen this taught in the past, and many kinds of different diagrams that you might have seen being used. But I am all about keeping things simple, so what I will provide is a really straightforward method. So just follow with me and I will provide a really simple method to understand homeostasis. First, there is something in the world that changes, some kind of a stimulus that triggers a reaction. And as I said, most often this is some sort of a change. Let's use an example. The temperature in a room where you're at has gotten colder. Now, how do we know that the temperature has gotten colder? Well, we have various sensors throughout the body. In this case, thermoreceptors pick up the change in temperature around us. Well, these sensors alone cannot do much about this. They only note that there is a change, but do not process this information. Instead, this information gets passed to the control center. Often in humans and other animals, the control center would be our brain. There we have some kind of a set point, and by this I mean a range of acceptable values, like in this example of ours, about temperature in a room where we are having gotten colder. This has been noted by thermoreceptors and passed into the brain, where we know that a normal body temperature for humans is 37 Celsius degrees. I believe that in Fahrenheit it is between 97 and 99 degrees. That is about normal. If it is anything above or below this, we may end up with problems. So our body has set this point for a range of temperatures. Now if we are off from this set point or a range of acceptable values, something must be done. An effector is recruited to do this. In our example, the responses could be many different kinds. I can think of both physiological and behavioral responses, like starting to shiver, that's muscle activity that produces heat, curling up, and little to reduce the amount of surface area from where the heat might evaporate, blood flow to the skin reducing to limit the heat loss via skin, and so on. Or we can put on another piece of clothing for more insulating layers, or go and turn on a thermostat a little higher, or move somewhere else where it's warmer. The goal of this is almost always to stop something from happening. This is known as negative feedback. Like in our example, we do not want to get too cold. Another much more rare option is that we actually sense something and want to keep that happening and make it happen even more. This would be positive feedback. There are only a few cases where this is true, childbirth and blood clotting being the ones that come to my mind. Say the baby is ready to be born and its head is starting to push the uterus. Within uterine lining, there are receptors that sense the stretch. And this information is passed to the brain and to the set point there. If it is more stretched than usual, as we usually would not be giving birth, we activate effectors. In this case, muscles start pushing the baby out and there is further stretch to the uterine walls. This helps to get the baby out. Homeostasis is defined as maintenance of consistent internal environment. Now let's have a look at a few more characteristics of life, and the next one that I have listed is energy. I think that I took this picture from your textbook, so let's use it as an example. I ask a question: how can this bird fly? Well, it needs energy to do so, and to get this energy, it needs to convert food that it has eaten into energy. This food has stored energy if it is plants by using sunlight, or if it is meat-eating animals by eating other animals that stored the food. Let's finish off this section by having a look at evolution as a characteristic of life. This is quite a common example used to describe what happens in evolution. So why did giraffes develop long necks? Well, it has been speculated that those individuals who had longer necks could reach food on trees better than those with short necks. So those individuals with these long necks were healthier and more attractive to mate with, and when they did, they passed on the genes for the longer necks. And slowly these characteristics accumulated and a long neck became common. So as you can see, evolution is gradual accumulation of changes over a long time, over many generations. So that's our list of common characteristics of life. I also want to mention a few further words about this concept of order in life. You will often see in textbooks that life is organized in many levels, and a list like this. The smallest level that we know is subatomic particles. But your textbook chooses to leave that out and instead talks about atoms as the smallest level. When multiple atoms join together, they may form a molecule. The next level then is cell organelles. These are located inside the cell, the parts that make up the cell. Cell is the smallest independent unit of life. Anything smaller than this is not able to live on its own. And a bunch of cells that work together for a similar goal, they form a tissue. Tissues then come together to form an organ, such as a stomach in this example. And a combination of several organs working together is an organ system. Finally, a human being is an example of an organism. I believe that much of this should be review for you, but if this is a completely new concept, let me know and we can revise it more. This is where most textbooks call it a day, but we can continue organizing a life even further. All individual organisms living in the same area form a population. Many populations then again a community. When all living and non-living things that are in that area get combined, we have an ecosystem, and the largest scale, our Earth, forms the biosphere. I guess that the biggest take-home message from this chapter is to appreciate how diverse life is. And life is everywhere on our planet, and it includes us too. So I cannot imagine anything more exciting to learn about than myself. So as well, to learn about life. And that's what our course will be all about. And this brings us to conclude our chapter material for this module. Thank you for following it with me.